he had snuck back into the home and was hiding behind the door. So when she came through the front door, he struck her on the back of the head, knocked her unconscious, and then she went in and out of consciousness enough that she recalled his dragging her back into a bedroom. And then, and he all the while was telling her many horrific things that he was going to do to her. I think as well with, in particular, sexual assault cases, it's so important when survivors are able to come forward and share their experience. Not always, and oftentimes it just doesn't land itself where we are able to prosecute the case. They're super hard to prove. But when a survivor is able to come forward and share their experience, it makes it that much easier in the event that there's another victim or some other incident that's happened, because sometimes we're able to piece those together and build a stronger case. So I, for example, one of my last jury trials involved an offender, Michael Flores, who he was paroled to Humboldt County after being released following convictions and having been sentenced to serve a 50-year sentence for sexual molestation of his stepdaughters, as well as the attempted murder of his then wife, who was the mother of the children he victimized. Crazy story. The little girls back in the day shared with their mom why they were having some troubles, and disclosed, that he had been abusing them. And he, while the mom was having the conversation with her little girls, he was on the other side of a door listening. So when the mom opened the door, he was there listening. And she, close in time, ended up going to law enforcement, making the report. He went on the run. She went back to the family home to get some of her belongings, and he had snuck back into the home and was hiding behind the door. So when she came through the front door, he struck her on the back of the head, knocked her unconscious, and then she went in and out of consciousness enough that she recalled his dragging her back into a bedroom. And then, and he all the while was telling her many horrific things that he was going to do to her. He then put lighter fluid or gasoline throughout the house and ended up lighting the house on fire, leaving her on the bed semi-unconscious. And but she awoke and was able to crawl, and she crawled out a window and escaped from the burning house and to the neighbors. And the neighbors then called the police, and then there was a really massive manhunt, and they ended up finding him. The woman that he had left in the burning house, she survived, and her daughters also survived, but they lived in terror. And when he was released from prison and paroled after serving just around half of his 50-year sentence, they had reached out because they were still quite afraid of him. And Mr. Flowers then reoffended, and he raped a young woman who was in her 20s and who had her own life struggles. She had a little girl of her own and was somewhat transient and probably struggled with some addiction issues. And she was essentially sold to Mr. Flowers against her will. And he brutally raped her. And the Rio Dale Police Department got word that this had happened, and they reached out and were able to get enough trust of this, 20-something-year-old young woman. And so we were able to file charges and able to give her enough support that she was able to get through the whole trial process, and she testified. And the little girls that he had sexually abused, nearly 30 years earlier, they testified during the trial. So that's just a really good example of how earlier reports or earlier incidences can become very significant, during the course in our ability to prove more recent incidences. And it might be that if the jurors hadn't had the opportunity to hear about Mr. Flowers' history of, frankly, it was rape. He raped those little girls. That they might not have, found the case to have been proven beyond a reasonable doubt for the more recent rape, in part, with this young woman having, some life challenges that, and it might have been more his word versus her word type of a situation. So I just really want to applaud all survivors that are brave enough to come forward and work with law enforcement and work with us. And I do acknowledge that we're not always able to proceed, in the moment on charges, but it's just so very important that people are able to do that and come forward.
Is that hard for you to hear about cases like that, especially where somebody commits a horrendous crime and then maybe goes away for a small amount of time and then comes back out and does something else? And you're like, we put this guy away for that reason because we knew something like this would happen again, and he got out. And then, especially, you hear about all the releases from like the county jail where we just don't have enough room, so people are getting released and then they commit a crime and then they go right back in, and then that cycle just continues. Is that hard for
Yes.
you as a prosecutor to hear that?
Yes, it's extremely hard. And for that Flowers example, I will never understand the math. I do not understand and will never understand how he was sentenced to 50 years and just around 25 years he's back out on the streets. That makes absolutely no sense to me. There are scenarios where other types of offenses, folks are given, day-for-day credit. So a 3-year sentence really is a year and a half. And then, like with COVID, there were all of these other, early release. And so, it's really hard. And I have, sexual molestation child victims where part of the reason we'll enter into plea agreements short of going to trial is to, spare them of the potential trauma of going through and having to testify about, horrific acts and sometimes, very personal acts and things, that,
You don't really want to rehash.
Yeah, you don't want to
public.
rehash in public. And I mean, it's just,
Understandable.
right.
Completely.
Very, very much so. And so that's one of the advantages. And then also the sense of like, okay, if we reach this agreement, we know what will happen. Whereas if we go to jury trial, no matter how strong of a case, there's always some risk that, not all convictions will be sustained. And then we don't know how the judge, sometimes, it's mandated by law, but we don't know exactly what the sentence might be. So there's some degree of risk. And also it's, often beneficial to have an earlier resolution. And so one of the things that we oftentimes talk with, in particular child victims, is, well, where do we want to have you in your life, when this person might re-enter the community? That's something we'll discuss. And, oftentimes the kids, they want to be adults. They want to be, okay, I would be about in college by then. So that's part of, the calculation if we're going to come up with some sort of determinate term, like specific number. And this is a discussion where, say, if an offender might be looking at a life sentence or, a high exposure. And okay, so we've had those discussions, and then maybe there's an agreement that's reached and everyone is at peace with it, and it's, a just resolution, and the offender's, sent off to prison. I have more than one case where, the mom of the victim or survivor, they'll look every single day. What's the earliest parole release date?
Oh, just checking the status for it.
Mm-hmm. And then, with the COVID and some of the other changes and sort of release protocols, they've, the board of parole, different changes, those numbers, were declining. And that's something that historically we wouldn't have seen, particularly with child molest cases. And that just breaks my heart, to think of being a mom. It's like, oh, well, I thought my daughter would be, 25 when he was going to get out. And now, she might only be, 23 or, something like that. And And I don't know that the general public, appreciates that, what some of these families go through. And it's, yeah.
Well, you can empathize, but to put yourself in that position is something that is near impossible until you're actually in that situation. I think you can you can see it from an outside perspective and recognize, oh my God, it's horrible, and I can't imagine how you're feeling, but you really can't imagine how they're feeling, even if you try to. I think that's just so detached from most people's lives until you're thrust into that situation of, oh, this actually happened now, and this is where we are, and this is our reality. But do you think that that's just, is that a knock on the system? Is the system falling apart for those victims, or is it just?
Oh, I think that's a system failure. I think that, that's when they're told a number and we're told a number, and that's what the laws say. I think that's how long that individual should be serving time for. Yeah.
And had those sentences been getting reduced prior to COVID, or did COVID really exacerbate that?
I think COVID exacerbated it to a certain extent, and I think that, and then it just kind of depends a little bit on the who's making those decisions and sort of the priorities.
Who gets the ultimate say in that? Is it the judge that handled the case, or is there a
Well,
board that oversees?
Yeah, so the governor can make changes. There can be board of parole decisions. The warden, so once the individual's sent to prison and has been sentenced to a certain extent, the sentencing court, loses jurisdiction, if you will, over how that time is actually served. But historically, for more serious violent offenses, those sentences, will be served as is. But then there can be certain special circumstances and, emergency legislation and, that can end up causing some earlier releases. And we saw a lot of that recently. There's been a tremendous trend, for lower levels of incarceration of folks, and sometimes that can be appropriate.
Yeah, if it's a drug, somebody was dealing weed, I would understand that they would get released. But lower level, I would consider like child molestation. I would not consider that lower level.
No.
So you hear about them reducing those charges, and it's like, well, okay, now is that really lower level? I mean, should we?
No.
Alter, yeah, right?
I'll answer that.
Yeah, it's not.
So,
do you get frustrated with that? Because I'm over here and I'm listening to that and I'm frustrated.
Of course I get frustrated. And that's why I think it's really important to have people, continuing to fight against that, and so it's like, just because other decision makers are leaning one way, it doesn't mean we don't continue to fight and continue to make our voice heard. We're not always going to get what we want, but we have to stand up for what's right.
In the case of that child molestation case where he only served 25 of the 50, is 25 in that case, was 25 the minimum that he had to, or that's just
I don't even know how that happened. Mm-hmm. That just like I say, I don't understand that. Nobody could explain it to me.
It's pretty crazy hearing that.
Yeah, and nobody could explain it to the victims. I doubt that the prosecutor that entered into that agreement, years past in an entirely different county, I bet that prosecutor would never have guessed that would have happened. But, it might have been related to Mr. Flores. He was getting older, but obviously not too old to rape again.